Well, 20 years ago this year, South Africa's democracy was born. It was described as a miracle. After years of conflict in April 1994, South Africans queued for hours to choose their new leaders. 2 decades on, though, how far have we come in realizing the ambitions of this young democracy and its constitution? Well, to unpack this now, we're joined by a few guests. Ashwin Desai is in our Durban studio. We have Judith February, who joins us from our Cape Town studio. And with me here in Johannesburg is Angelo Fick. A very good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us on this Monday morning. Angelo, we'll start with you. Should we be celebrating a democracy 20 years on? Are we celebrating a democracy here?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, but I think that there are reasons to celebrate, but there are also reasons to take some very serious reflections back on the 20 years and what was promised to ordinary South Africans in 1994 and what was not delivered. And there are some key areas of great concern that really don't allow us to celebrate too much. And they're healthcare provision to ordinary citizens, education, housing and safety.
Ashwin, I'd like to know from you, 20 years, is that enough time for us to say that we should have achieved all these goals? Or is it sort of a reasonable time and to say, look, we still have more time and you know, there's enough time for that work to be done?
Well, I think the way to approach that question is, are we on the right track? Because no matter how much time goes, if you're on the wrong track, then it doesn't matter whether it's 20 years or 50 years or 80 years. And we've seen many post-liberation societies have incredible promises at the beginning and then just go completely off track and never get it back. So many of us are questioning whether we're on the right track and that in 20 more years' time, we will be better off. And I think there are real questions to be asked about this. The National Development Plan has rightly come under focus as whether it is the signpost into the future. And already we can see in the debates about it that there are deep questions to be asked. But, Minister Manuel said in launching the National Development Program, that plan, that we should worry about the icebergs up ahead. I think what many of us are worried about is the mutiny on the ship already, the explosives that the ship carry, and that's unemployment, poverty and inequality.
So fair to say then, Judith, we are not on the right track at the moment? Hi, Judith, can you hear me? All right,
well, I think that, good morning, I think that there are obviously enormous challenges. If we look at our unemployment rate, we're sitting at the level of 25.7%. That's 4.5 million people out of work, and that number is set to grow. And while the National Development Plan does provide us with certain milestones, I think the problem is that we don't have a total consensus, which is perhaps not a bad thing, but not a total consensus of exactly how we're going to implement the National Development Plan. Because of course the plan is it provides certain milestones, it provides certain goals, but it is not set in stone, as it were. And so it seems as if we are constantly at loggerheads about how to get to a point where we are reducing unemployment and also, more importantly, inequality.
Angelo, let's look at just what's happening and let's look at the state of mind of ordinary South Africans today. We're looking at questions around eNCA. We're looking at the secrecy bill, and in the time of Madiba passing, we had this quickly happening and people didn't even know that this was signed and it was done. We knew it was coming, but we just didn't know it would be done at that time. Just all of the stuff that South Africans feel they're not getting answers. And can you have a democracy? Can you say we're in a democracy when you have situations like that with the eNCA report and the issues around it and things like the secrecy bill and the debate around that continues?
Well, I think that there is increasingly a gap between what citizens are told will be delivered to them on paper via a constitution and by government or by state organs that are supposed to deliver those rights, and a particular governing group, so the government in power at the time, and its demands for a certain kind of power. And it's always been there. I think it is the nature of government and citizenship relationships the world over. But in South Africa, I think it's become particularly difficult for citizens to not see the spectacular examples of state abuse and abuse by state officials of resources, at the same time as looking into their own backyards and seeing the lack of resources they have. So if you have an eNCA built in a year in which there are thousands of people without homes, in which people actually get into a social conflict situation around service delivery, in which education is as poorly managed as it is, in which healthcare is as unavailable to people on an everyday basis as it is. I think there are symbolic conflicts between how the state sees the celebration of democracy and how ordinary citizens possibly experience what looks like democracy, but actually also has its aspects of deprivation.
I like that you say what looks like democracy. Ashwin, are we seeing that there is a perception of democracy, that there's a perceived democracy? South Africans are being told there is a democracy, but there actually really isn't.
Well, I mean, if you take the last 20 years, just think about who wanted to circumscribe our democracy and who wanted to broaden it. And you'll see in most cases, it is the state that tries to circumscribe our democracy, and it's civil society that tries to broaden it. And it is this contestation that takes place all the time. And you can see it from the secrecy bill to the aftermath of Marikana. But I think there's something deeper here. On May the 10th, 1994, when President Mandela assumed power, we had a sense that all things were possible, that we were makers of history. And if you look at today, we have a sense that where's the vision? We want more than democracy. Where's the dreams? Where's the sense that all things are possible? Rather, we kept being told that we are the victims of history, that it's apartheid, that it's the global economic climate. And I think that's what we miss 20 years later. You think that our dreams have grown, our horizons have got bigger and further, but somehow that seems to be circumscribed every day. And I think the secrecy bill, for example, is an example of that, not just the contents, but the sense that this is a society that is always on the edge of wanting to be more secret from the state side and from the population side to have more openness, more transparency.
So Judith, it does seem to ordinary South Africans, and just also from talking to people, engaging their feelings, is that they feel that a lot of the politicians, a lot of the people who are making the decisions for them from day to day have actually forgotten the people and are more interested in just protecting their own interests. And is that true from just your observations? Are our politicians, are our bigwigs in government only looking after their own interests, and the poor seem to be getting poorer?
Well, I think if we look at what's happened, particularly in the past year, we've had a rather rough year with regard to issues of corruption. We've had the allegations around Nkandla. We've had certain real threats made against the Public Protector's Office and certain Chapter 9 institutions, but also the issue of Guptagate. And it does seem as if there is a certain arrogance in power. We saw what happened, allegations against Diana Pula, for example, and also allegations swirling around Tina Jimmer-Peterson. And there does seem to be an arrogance of power where certain politicians believe that they are simply able to do what they please and that they're not circumscribed by the Constitution. And of course, given the fact that we have the secrecy bill, which the President still needs to sign into law, that creates an environment in which people seem to think there is a perception that politicians and certain individuals are above the law. And that obviously doesn't augur well for trying to embed 20 years later a culture of constitutional democracy, a culture of openness, and a culture in which people have the right to know.
Now, Angelo, many argue that we've had centuries of oppression, we've had lots of damage done, we've had a lot of stuff, even if we look at the Limpopo textbook saga, a lot of that attributed to apartheid and the damage that's been done. Is it, again, I'm going to ask you, fair to say that 20 years is enough time for us to be judging and asking these questions now? Have we done enough and have we come far enough? Does it have anything to do with what we're undoing?
Well, I think we need to separate the question of what was achieved or not achieved in 20 years and the comparison with what is really a substantial and quite hampering legacy of colonialism and apartheid. Because I think there's too often a resort to blaming apartheid and blaming colonialism for issues that could have been resolved in 20 years but haven't been. So, for example, if you have 20 years and you have the resources flung at education that we've had in this country, you cannot continue to blame 350 years of colonialism and 50 years of structured white supremacy. The economy is a different story because there you're looking at the imbrication of the South African economy into a global economy, and so South Africa's non-performance in terms of economic achievement for its ordinary citizens may be part of a global trend, as analysis would show. But in terms of healthcare, infrastructure development, we've certainly spent the money on it as a country in 20 years, and we've spent money on some spectacular vanity projects in those 20 years, but not to ordinary citizens as a matter of course, rather as a matter of exception. So the rollout of a new school every week is a promise, the building of a certain number of houses in particular election years, those are significant symbolic achievements. But we have to aggregate what has this governing party done over 20 years, and does that track record of 20 years show us the direction, as Ashwin has pointed out, in which we're moving? And if we accept that direction, then there are certain consequences.
Ashwin, what would you say are the problems in government at the moment? Do we have the tools to move forward and go in that direction that we want to go? Or do we have a problem where the right people are not in the right jobs?
I think there is a real problem of how the state thinks it wants to steer itself in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that they are facing deep contestations around policy. I think in 1994, there was a general sense about the Reconstruction Development Program. Very little criticism of that. And you had a nation that was behind a program. Today, the National Development Program doesn't capture the imagination of people in that sense, both on the ground and inside of the government. And once again, we have a problem of capacity. Do we have the skills to implement these kinds of plans? And we see that in our education policies, in terms of our economic policies, how that is lacking. So there are difficulties up ahead. Firstly, and those are the icebergs that Minister Manuel talked about, but there's a sense about how, as you're moving forward, the people that you're carrying on the ship become recalcitrant and start to protest. And those insurgent protests, how do you respond to them? And I think the way the government wants to respond to insurgent protests from below is to put a clamp on it, not to take those protests seriously. And I think here you got real problems that we face in the next 10, 15 years.
Judith, is it all doom and gloom though? I mean, are there any positives we can take from what's happened over the past 20 years?
I think it's not certainly doom and gloom. We have a lot that we have achieved. I think in terms of, for example, delivery of social grants and so on, and also in terms of healthcare and housing and so on. But we have to be clear that we have massive challenges. If we look at the National Development Plan, we see that government's plan on the economy is to invest in infrastructure and also to look at manufacturing and industrial policy and the Industrial Policy Action Plan. But we see that there is not a clarity on this. One of the things that I think that we're lacking is leadership. We seem to have too many people steering too many little ships. And really, who is steering ship South Africa? And on issues of the economy, you have Praveen Gordhan saying one thing, you have Rob Davies doing his thing, Trevor Manuel, Jacob Zuma somewhere. And the question is, we need stronger leadership, I think, which is also able to take civil society with it. And we haven't seen that in the past few years. And we've also seen the splintering, unfortunately, of the trade union movement and the Tripartite Alliance, which has been really the sponge at the centre of our society to really absorb much of the tension in our society. And that seems to be falling apart and really fragile at the moment, reflecting many of the divisions in the ANC. And that, I think, is going to be a major challenge for us as we move into 2014.
All right, and at this moment, I just want to apologize for that delay that we have with Judith, but she is hearing us and is able to answer our questions as we know. Just picking up from what Judith said, and earlier what Ashwin spoke about, Angelo, is about the mutiny on the ship at the moment. Yes. And Judith talking about the splintering of the trade unions. We saw the booing of Jacob Zuma at Madiba's memorial last year. Are we taking that as a sign of exactly how all South Africans are feeling?
Well, I think that there is, for me, a distinction between how ordinary citizens behave and think and what can be seen as a fracture in the power block upon which the African National Congress has built its governance for 20 years. It may be that the partners have become disillusioned, that their particular the promises made to them for what would be delivered to their constituents haven't come forth, and they have pressure from there. So particularly in the unions, I think there is great unease that the people that they represent or claim to represent have been left out to a large extent of a whole series of, rewards that have been going around in the 20 years that we've had the ANC in government. But what I think we must be clear on is that there is this constant equivocation between, oh well, things are horrible, but we have had gains, and that isn't really how ordinary citizens experience their lives. We don't go around, I mean, for us in the middle classes, there have been substantial gains, and we can constantly talk about what is missing. But ordinary people scrabbling at the very bottom end of the economic ladder, trying to make a life, for them there isn't this constant reminder of what has worked in 20 years, but there is a constant battle against what hasn't worked in 20 years. And I think we are getting to a boiling point in this country, particularly in this election here, where there are real concerns by ordinary people about the future that they face. And whether or not that will affect their voting patterns is something that needs to be seen later in this year. But it will affect the ways in which social protests happen, the ways in which people display their anger, their disaffection, their dissatisfaction and their rage.
But is anybody listening?
Whether anybody is listening or not is also a different question, because I think, as Ashwin's pointed out before, the role that the government or the state has appointed to itself is the circumscription of democracy and its workings, and the apportioning of more and more power unto itself by legislative means or by force. What I think has happened is that the non-governmental organisational sector and the civil society sector has done some of the work of government, which has given government even more relaxation time to apportion power unto itself. So what looks often like it's working is often not direct will on the part of the state. It's often forced to do that. So we're looking at a very complicated scenario in which how people vote and how they protest might not have an easy correlation.
Ashwin, you spoke earlier, and I'm going back to what you said, is we look at the mutiny on the ship at the moment. Is it time for a change of captain, whether it's the president, whether it's the party?
Well, I'm not sure about that. What intrigues me about this period we are going through is that constantly we are told, both by social commentators, academics, and people in government, that people need to be patient and they need to make sacrifices. Yet the people in government who are calling on the masses to do that don't appear to do it themselves. So that's why Nkandla becomes such a flashpoint, because on the one hand you have incredible extravagance, incredible sense that we can do what we want with taxpayers' money. On the other hand, you get people saying after 20 years, live in your shack, have no running water, have no toilets, something will happen. And I think this is the disjuncture that indicates that people have a sense that the ship is not going in the right direction, that first class has just got a few more black people in first class, and that what the National Development Plan represents is a changing of the deck chairs, not a changing of direction. And that's what Polokwane promised. It promised a changing of a direction, a changing of a sense of where this country is going vis-a-vis Thabo Mbeki. Well, it appears to me that there's been no change of direction, that we're heading towards the iceberg, and nobody seems to want to take any sense that this is an urgent matter, that we're in a state of emergency in this country. It's not a sort of luxury position of just waiting another 20 years and having an analysis.
Judith, let's not forget the role of our opposition parties here. Do we have a strong enough opposition? Is it doing its job? And if not, what needs to be done to make that opposition stronger and fight for the ordinary South Africans on the ground?
Well, I think that in South African politics, looking at the opposition, obviously the role is rather limited. If you look at, for example, the Democratic Alliance, which has 16% of the vote, and that's never going to really be. The Democratic Alliance isn't speaking to the aspirations of the majority of South Africans. And we look at the other political parties in Parliament who valiantly try, but they really are not hitting at the heart of of it are not creating an electoral threat for the ANC, which might be able to bring about that sort of change that we're looking for in electoral politics and indeed within the ANC. I mean, we're talking about a ruling party which has 65+% of the vote, and so really for it to be hit hard in terms of accountability, we need to have a greater threat to it. And I think that when we talk about this so-called fight against corruption and issues of maladministration and so on, we have seen actually that the opposition is coming from, whether it's within COSATU, Zwelinzima Vavi or Corruption Watch, the Public Protector, etc., that's where it's coming from. And, you know, we really need to be thinking about strategies to be holding those who are in power to account in a greater way, because it's not really happening on the opposition benches. But just to the point around questions of corruption, I think that this is what is causing a lot of people despondency. And when you have the Minister of Finance saying ministers have to give up credit cards and have to give up extravagant splurges on cars and hotels, and those rules are simply flouted. And unfortunately, the example for that starts at the top. And so if you don't have serious rules set by the President, you know, everybody beneath is going to simply carry on flouting the rules. And so these are the kinds of disjunctures that we have, which make it extremely difficult for us to create progress and also a sense of social solidarity.
All right, well, we could talk for hours about this, but I just want to wrap it up, Angelo, very quickly by asking you, in a nutshell, where do you see this year's election going?
Well, I have no crystal ball, so I can't
just
really
your feeling,
say.
just your gut feeling. Let's go to your gut.
My gut feeling is that the ANC will probably be voted back into power, but with a very much reduced majority, and I think that there will have to be some sort of scrabble among opposition parties to form, or the other smaller parties to form a viable opposition, because we haven't really had a viable opposition.
And we see that in the makings already. I mean,
we see that with
part,
but I mean, the current official opposition is not part of that, and my concern is that in answer to your question to Judith, for example, that the official opposition has gone on record several times as saying that they agree with the ruling party's policy. They just disagree with the inefficiency of that implementation. Now, there are real questions for concern there, because if we efficiently implement those policies, are we looking at a better South Africa, or are we looking at a better South Africa for a small group of people and a worse South Africa for a growing number of others?
Ashwin, your take on where you see elections 2014 going?
Well, I see elections 2014 as telling us about 2019, really. I think the ANC will come back to power, but I think it'll be a reality check for the opposition. How do oppositions unite? What does the EFF do? How does it respond to the ballot box? And I think it's a race against time. I think the ANC will fracture increasingly after the election. At the same time, can an opposition from the ground up, especially young people, with a much more deeper radical program, be able to coalesce into a coherent force? So for me, 2014 is more a flag for 2019, and that's a very short time in politics, 4 or 5 years. And I think we're up. It's not about doom and gloom. We're up for some exciting times in South Africa, because in 1994, nobody would have thought that NUMSA would be coming up against COSATU, and COSATU would be fracturing, the union would be fracturing, that inside of the alliance there would be deep debates, and coming out of the alliance would be a really very exciting opposition movement in terms of the EFF.
Judith, do you envisage exciting changes or exciting times for us after the election this year?
Well, we've got the Chinese curse of living in interesting times. I don't think 2014 is the watershed or tipping point that people say. The ANC conference in 2017 is, I think, what we should be looking at, and indeed the 2019 elections. We haven't talked about the so-called youth vote and the 3 million votes that are out there of the so-called born frees. What is their perception of this democracy and how we are doing? Are they going to register? Are they going to show their displeasure? what is their political orientation. And I think that that provides us with an opportunity in terms of the growth and consolidation of our democracies. So we certainly do live in interesting times, and also ways in which to think about our constitutional democracy. We've got the eNCA report coming out, a real test for the public protector and also for this administration about how they relate to Chapter 9 institutions. And I predict that that's also going to be a challenge for Parliament. And here are real opportunities for Parliament, for example, to assert itself. And so we have many challenges, but also opportunities.
All right, thanks very much for that insightful discussion to our panelists, Ashwin Desai in Durban, Judith February, who's in Cape Town, and Angelo Fick here in Johannesburg with me.
Know more about your world. eNCA.com